Hello everyone, wherever you happen to be on this beautiful blue planet. Today I bring you episode 74, which will continue on with this second series on animal physiology by exploring the dynamics of animal gas exchange. This episode is the second in this series, which makes it analogous to the animal hydration episode in the previous series. And that's not coincidental. Both water and oxygen are critically necessary for animal life. Without either one of these crucial resources, the animal will quickly die. End of story. Some animals are specialized to endure droughts, like camels, just as other animals are specialized to endure long periods without breathing, like whales. But given enough time, without water or without oxygen, the animal will eventually die. The big difference here is that while an animal can survive for a few days without water before dying of dehydration, most animals can only survive for a few minutes without oxygen, maybe even a few seconds, depending on their size. Insects, for example, will die if they go without oxygen for more than a few seconds. Humans will suffocate in a few minutes. The point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that oxygen is an immediate and critical need for an animal organism, which largely gets used for cellular respiration and oxidative phosphorylation to produce chemical energy. More specifically, the ability to inhale oxygen and disperse it throughout the body, and to extract waste carbon dioxide and exhale it from the body, is of paramount importance to the animal. Without oxygen, the animal suffocates. Without waste CO2 being released, the animal can experience CO2 poisoning and die. So, without sugarcoating anything, gas exchange in animals is an absolutely critical aspect of animal existence. How exactly this all works on a cellular level is what I'll be discussing today. In addition to gas exchange, I'll also be exploring the animal's circulatory system. And this is because gas exchange in larger animals requires the circulatory system, as larger animals require this deep vascular perforation within their tissues so as to maximize the diffusion and spread of both nutrients from food and the gases used and created through respiration. Okay, so to get started, I'll begin at a natural starting point, when oxygen is first consumed by the animal's body. This is called ventilation, which is a very general term to mean the stage where gases are exchanged across an animal's organ. Oxygen coming into the body of a fish through its gills is ventilation. In mammals, carbon dioxide can get diffused out of the blood, diffused through the alveoli into the lungs, where it then gets exhaled, and this is also ventilation. On a chemical level, this gas exchange occurs at the surface of the organ, at the interface between the chaotic outside environment and the organized chemical superstructure that is the animal's body. As this gas is absorbed into the bloodstream, it gets circulated around and it gets taken where it needs to go. Oxygen gets delivered through the blood to the tissues that need it to produce energy, and waste carbon dioxide moves back through the blood to the lungs where it gets removed. The critical step is cellular respiration, where molecules of these gases are used by individual cells to stay alive and produce the energy that they need to perform various cellular functions. This aerobic cellular respiration is an ancient chemical process that's so efficient and so powerful that the animals' macroscopic bodies have literally evolved around this. Their bodies have only been able to evolve to the size and complexity that they are because this chemical process is just so efficient and yields so much energy. I want to talk about the beginning and the ending stages of the process of respiration, where ventilation occurs as gases are exchanged across the membranes. To explain how this works, I first need to touch on Dalton's law, which states that a mixture of gases applies a pressure within its volume, and that the component gases within this mixture can have their partial pressures calculated. The partial pressure is the portion of the total pressure that particular individual gas is responsible for. all of the partial pressures from all of the gases involved in the mixture adds up to equal the total pressure. Now, in the real world, this manifests itself as the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury, or the pressure that's applied under the mass of a column of mercury X millimeters tall, under standard temperature and gravity. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury, and oxygen, composing just 21% of the atmosphere, has a partial pressure of 160 millimeters of mercury. It's really important to understand partial pressure, because gases will tend to flow in the direction of their partial pressure gradient, just like how solutes will tend to flow in the direction of their concentration gradient. Secondly, I need to explain Fick's law, which calculates the rate of gas diffusion according to K, the diffusion constant, A, the area for gas exchange, the differences in partial pressure, which are P2 minus P1, and the distance of the barrier to diffusion. This creates a clean little equation that goes K times A times parentheses P2 minus P1 parentheses divided by D, which can be applied to virtually everything, including biological systems. For example, in the human lung, the epithelium of the alveoli has a huge surface area. So A is large, the surface area is very large. The thickness of the membranes of these alveoli cells is measured in decimals of a micrometer, so D is relatively small. Oxygen diffusion into the animal is maintained by having a large difference between P2 and P1, which promotes gas exchange exactly like how a larger difference in solute concentration will create a stronger gradient. Now, all of this data, when multiplied by the variable K, which represents the solubility of oxygen gas at a human habitable temperature, all of this can tell us our optimal rate of oxygen diffusion into our bodies. Furthermore, there are aspects of the solution that influence how gases are absorbed and diffused. In cases where the natural physics of gas absorption aren't really favorable for life, life can evolve ways around it. For example, oxygen naturally dissolves pretty poorly in water. Something like 0.003 milliliters of oxygen dissolves per 100 milliliters of water, per each millimeter of mercury in pressure. This natural rate of absorption is not able to sustain life, so animals have evolved enzymes like hemoglobin that bind to oxygen and facilitate its dissolution and diffusion through the blood. With respect to the ocean and the atmosphere, gas exchange occurs at the surface of the ocean, right at the interface between sky and water, so the upper layers of the ocean tend to be more oxygen-rich than the deeper layers. Water currents have to come in and mix the water so that this oxygen can sweep across the ocean floor and sustain the animal life that lives there. Other factors include the temperature of the solution, where gases tend to dissolve less efficiently in warmer solutions. Warmer water can hold less oxygen than colder water, so fish in colder water can actually breathe easier than fish in warmer water, simply because there's more dissolved oxygen available. Any solutes that happen to exist within the solution can also influence gas absorption, where more solutes means less gas can be absorbed. Seawater, for example, is rich in solutes, and thus seawater is much less absorptive of oxygen than freshwater, like in lakes and rivers. Now, with respect to freshwater, rivers that are fast-moving and rugged with lots of rapids or splashing, those will have a relatively high surface area to volume ratio, and thus a relatively high surface area in contact with the water. And both of these things increase gas exchange, and they increase the oxygen content in the water. Now lastly, and perhaps most importantly, gas absorption in a liquid solution follows the law of partial pressure gradients. If there's a higher partial pressure of gas in the water solution than there is in the atmosphere, the gas will diffuse out of the water and back into the atmosphere. It follows like a concentration gradient. The ambient biology can even influence the gas environment of a particular habitat. For example, in a marine habitat, there's photosynthetic organisms in the water, like cyanobacteria, and through their photosynthesis, they'll produce a lot of oxygen that can diffuse into and enrich the surrounding water. Conversely, if you have clouds of zooplankton and other microscopic animal organisms, they can form these giant oxygen-sucking clouds that just swim through a region of ocean and absorb all of the oxygen out of it, and breathe out a lot of carbon dioxide, which makes the water a little more acidic. These equations and facts are all really important dynamics of gas movement that you should be at least familiar with before I go into any more detail. To really dig into the biological, animal aspect of gas exchange, I should first look at the different structures that animals have evolved to do it, like gills and tracheal networks and lungs. Gills are present in marine animals, as gills function to pull oxygen out of the surrounding water. In invertebrate species, the gills are widely varied. They can be internal, running along some body wall and requiring cilia or a limb or something to move water over them, or they can be external, like a tube worm with a flashy hair-like protrusion of thin cylindrical gills coming out of its body. Vertebrate gills are much less varied, with only one basic design. The gills exist on either side of the head, immediately behind the mouth, and they include a number of arches, or columns of tissue that are lined with gill filaments. These gill filaments are covered in even smaller structures called gill lamellea, which are like thin nodes or sheets. Whatever structure they take, these gill filaments are designed so that water flows over them in one direction. The gill lamellea are aligned such that water flows between them, which helps to maximize surface area. The lamellea are packed with capillary beds that absorb this incoming oxygen out of the water. The capillary beds themselves are part of a circulatory network that's organized into a counter-current arrangement. Countercurrents are two currents that flow in opposite directions, and in biological systems, that can have some really important advantages. Namely, this countercurrent arrangement in the vasculature allows for the maintenance of the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the entire gill structure, which allows for steady, continual oxygen absorption. The fish isn't losing oxygen gas out of its gills. The water flows in one direction over the gills, from front of the gill to the back. And as water flows over the gill, the oxygen in the water gets absorbed into the animal. The water at the front of the gill is high in oxygen, but by the time the water gets to the end of the gill, it's had as much as 85% of its oxygen removed. Now the blood flows in the opposite direction. The blood comes from the body and runs along the backside of the lamellea, and then it flows through the capillary beds to the front of the lamellea, before running back out of the gills again to return to the body. So the blood and the water both share the same pattern of oxygen concentration, rich at the front and poor at the back. At every point along the length of the gill, the oxygen's partial pressure inside the animal is lower than it is outside the animal, so oxygen is always diffusing in across the entire length of the gill. This makes gills a remarkably efficient and thorough respiratory organ, which marine animals need when they're in a watery environment that may not have an ideal amount of oxygen. However, a problem is that because of their surface area and high vascularity, gills are also a place for water and solute exchange, which is usually a complication for the marine animal. I talked about this in the episode on animal hydration, but to briefly summarize, saltwater fish can actually lose water out of their gills, and freshwater fish can lose solutes out of their gills. And both types of fish have evolved respective mechanisms of osmoregulation to keep themselves in balance. But understand that this is largely an aquatic problem. Terrestrial animals don't have to worry about solutes, like nutrients, leaking out of their mouths, because dry air simply doesn't facilitate that kind of diffusion like water does. Insects and vertebrates that live on dry land and that breathe dry air have had to evolve different systems to extract their oxygen. The biggest threat for these organisms is dehydration through water evaporation. But this is largely a problem for smaller animals, like insects, where a tiny change in internal water concentration can be potentially lethally damaging. Larger animals, like many mammals, will pant or sweat so as to exploit evaporation to cool themselves down. Water loss through regular breathing isn't really a threat to the health of larger animals, but to insects, regular breathing can be potentially dangerous. Insects breathe through an organ system called a trachea, or a trachea network. And this is like a series of vascular tubes that run throughout the insect's body, and which reach out to the surface at various points to create little spiracles. These spiracles are pores that lead into the tracheal network, and they can be opened or closed at will. The tracheal network itself is literally an open series of passageways and corridors that permeate throughout the insect's body, with highly branching tips that innervate as much of the insect's tissue as possible. Now, in very, very tiny insects, the size of their body allows oxygen gas to flow into and through their tracheal network, and supply all of their tissues with oxygen, all through simple diffusion alone. This unaided form of gas-based circulation is only possible because the distances involved are extremely tiny, because the insects are very small, their bodies are super small, and so diffusion is able to move nutrients across the entire length of these insects' bodies. This unaided form of gas-based circulation is only possible because the distances involved are extremely small, because the insects' bodies are so tiny. However, larger insects, they can't rely on diffusion alone, and so they had to evolve a few more tricks to enable them to grow so large. First, larger insects have disproportionately larger tracheal tubes. This is to say that if you took a small insect and somehow enlarged it while keeping its proportions the same, it would have smaller tracheal tubes than an insect which is naturally a larger size. The larger tubes exploit the cross-sectional area component of Fick's law, and they enable greater gas flow through the insect's body. Furthermore, insects have muscle tissue that they use to flex their bodies, to move their legs, to flap their wings, and to wave around their antennae. The flexion of all of these muscles, especially larger muscles that the insect uses to walk or to fly, these can create internal distortions within the insect's body, and these distortions and contractions in the tracheal network can help push gas around. Through using their muscles, the insects can change the size of passageways and the overall volume of the tracheal network. Changing volume can change pressure, and this active, dynamic flexing of muscles, typically in a rhythmic pattern like legs walking or wings flapping, can create internal currents in the airflow through the tracheal network. And this can not only improve the flow rate of gas, and thus improve gas exchange, but it also allows for the capacity to breathe gases in and out, as opposed to just depending solely on passive diffusion. The size of a large insect is constrained by the oxygen content of the atmosphere. A higher oxygen content in the atmosphere, like that which existed in the Paleozoic era, supplied a higher partial pressure of oxygen, and this in turn improved its solubility in organic substrates. Gas exchange was easier, and insects could grow much larger bodies, with some growing to be more than 2 feet in length. Nowadays, our atmospheric oxygen content and its partial pressure are significantly lower, and so large insects have to balance fitness trade-offs. They can't be so large that they can't diffuse oxygen to all their tissues, because then their tissue will just start to die and they'll start to rot from the inside out. But they also can't make their trachea passages arbitrarily large to compensate for this, because making their tracheal passages arbitrarily large would take up physical space, and it would crowd out the room inside of the exoskeleton that's required for organs and for muscles, like muscles that would have to be strong enough to move these arbitrarily large tracheal passages. You can see how there's a whole host of fitness trade-offs that these larger insects have to balance back and forth here. Beyond insects, you have land-dwelling vertebrates, like elephants and Komodo dragons and human beings, and all of these vertebrates have, in my opinion, the most interesting respiratory structures. They have lungs. Now I should mention that some fish, and even some invertebrates, also possess lungs, but it's a universal trait among land-dwelling vertebrates. In these animals, oxygen gets inhaled through the mouth. It gets carried through a part of the throat called the trachea, which then splits into the left and right bronchi, which feed into each lung. Within the lungs, each bronchi ends up branching and splitting into smaller and smaller passages called bronchioles. Once you get past this basic setup, the respiratory systems tend to begin to differ between major animal lineages. One of the major points of division is the use of positive or negative pressure ventilation, or to put it another way, how oxygen is brought into the body and how carbon dioxide is expelled. In frogs and other amphibians, they tend to use positive pressure ventilation, where the oxygen is pushed into the lungs. A frog will lower the floor of its mouth, which increases the internal volume and pulls air in through its nose. Then the frog will close its nose and use internal muscle actions to push the air from the mouth into its lungs. It's like swallowing the air that it breathes. In contrast, you have mammals which use negative pressure ventilation. In negative pressure ventilation, oxygen is pulled into the lungs instead of pushed. To inhale, a mammal has to lower its diaphragm, which is a muscular structure below the lungs. This descending motion of the diaphragm is paired with an expansion of the ribs, and together, all of this stretches the lungs and increases their internal volume, and this decreases the internal pressure relative to the outside air. Air will then flow along this pressure gradient and flow into the lungs. And when the diaphragm and the muscles around the ribs relax, the lungs return to their original size, and any excess gas is forcefully expelled in an exhale. So there's positive and negative pressure ventilation, but then you have birds, and birds are just weird. Birds have rather strange lungs, where air flows not in and out along the same tract from inhalation and exhalation, but rather it flows in a single direction. When the bird inhales, air flows through the trachea into two large air sacs that are held behind the lungs. When the bird exhales, this air is pushed into the tiny bronchi of the true lungs. Now the bird inhales again, and more air is brought into the posterior air sacs. The air that's currently in the rear of the lungs is pushed up to the front of the lungs, where it then flows into a series of anterior air sacs. And then the bird has its second exhale, where the air in these anterior air sacs is expelled from the body, and the air in the posterior air sacs is moved into the lungs. Now this is a complicated but powerful system, which uses a two-breath system to maintain unidirectional airflow. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense that birds had to evolve a tremendously efficient respiratory system, because 1, flying is hard. It takes a huge amount of energy to fly. And 2, when you're flying really high up in the air, the atmospheric density is much lower, so there's a lot less available oxygen. This unidirectional respiratory system allows birds to use their air more efficiently, as they can absorb oxygen during both inhalation and exhalation. Also, the arrangement of the blood vessels within the bird's lung makes it much more efficient than a mammal's lung at pulling oxygen out of the air. But it's less efficient than the gills of a fish. Animals of all types have to regulate their rate of respiration so as to keep an internal balance of the oxygen and carbon dioxide in their tissues. During vigorous exercise, tissues will use more oxygen, and they'll produce more waste carbon dioxide, which respectively decreases and increases their partial pressure in the blood. The CO2 in the blood reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates to form a proton and a bicarbonate ion. The end result is that more CO2 in the blood can make the blood slightly more acidic, and this can potentially be dangerous. It can be dangerous if nothing is done about it. The blood itself is a connective tissue composed of cells within a fluid matrix. These cells include platelets, which are small little cell fragments that physically and chemically promote clotting, which is the first step in wound healing. Then there's white blood cells, which are immune cells that help fight off pathogens, and there's the classic erythrocyte, the red blood cells, with their iron-containing hemoglobin proteins that bind to and carry around oxygen and protons. Hemoglobin is a critically important protein because it increased the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, which could then, in turn, support more cellular respiration, more energy production. And then this, in turn, directly supports the growth of larger tissues and larger organisms. So, a typical hemoglobin molecule is a tetramer, which means that it's composed of 4 smaller protein subunits. Each one of these subunits is a protein that wraps around a non-protein iron-containing molecule called heme. A single hemoglobin molecule has 4 of these proteins, each of them wrapped around a heme molecule, for a total of 4 heme molecules. The oxygen will bind to these heme molecules. They bind to the iron ion that's in the heme, which means that each hemoglobin can carry up to 4 oxygen atoms at a time. What's really interesting is that hemoglobin exhibits cooperative binding, where the binding of one oxygen atom makes the other subunits change their conformation so as to become more likely to bind to another oxygen atom. So as the hemoglobin picks up oxygen, it gets a stronger and a stronger affinity for binding to oxygen. Conversely, as oxygen gets removed, the conformation changes reduce this affinity and make the hemoglobin more and more likely to release oxygen. Now, this chemical quality of hemoglobin makes it exceptionally good at either picking up or dropping off a whole lot of oxygen, which is why it's so good at shuttling around oxygen throughout the body. Whether the hemoglobin is picking up or dropping off oxygen, that depends on the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, and hemoglobin happens to be particularly sensitive to this partial pressure. For example, during exercise, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood will drop as the muscle cells consume oxygen at a high rate. This relatively small change in the partial pressure of oxygen, like a change of just 10 millimeters of mercury, can lead to hemoglobin dumping 25% more of its oxygen into cellular tissues. Now earlier, I talked about qualities of a liquid solution that could influence gas diffusion, like temperature and solute concentration. Well, blood is a liquid solution, and blood's temperature and blood's pH can influence the activity of hemoglobin. For example, more CO2 in the blood makes the blood more acidic, as CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid. And so the subsequently lower pH makes hemoglobin more likely to release its oxygen. Now this is a pretty neat evolutionary tactic, because if you look at it from the reverse, it means that less CO2, and thus a higher blood pH, will make hemoglobin more likely to pick up oxygen, which is exactly what you want in a place like the lungs, where most of the CO2 has just been released, and the blood pH is relatively high, and there's incoming oxygen that's ready to be picked up and distributed to the tissues. Another interesting aspect of the circulatory system is the pH regulatory strategies that are used to help buffer against the CO2 concentration. When CO2 is released by the tissues and CO2 is released into the blood and it gets absorbed by red blood cells, It'll react with water and the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to produce carbonic acid, and this will then decay into bicarbonate ions, HCO3-, and protons, or H+. This conversion process consumes a molecule of CO2 and lowers the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, which then encourages the blood to absorb more CO2 out of the tissues. The subsequently produced bicarbonate ions are expelled out of the blood cell into the blood plasma. This means that most CO2 actually travels in the blood plasma itself in the form of these bicarbonate ions. It's not actually carried by a red blood cell. Now, the protons from this carbonic acid breakdown are contained within the blood cells. These protons are attracted to hemoglobin that only has a few oxygen atoms attached, and this effectively soaks up the protons and removes them from the blood, which decreases the blood's acidity. In other words, this means that the hemoglobin is a buffer that helps to control blood pH. Okay, so I'm clearly starting to talk more and more about the circulatory system, so I want to briefly explain this before tying it all together. The circulatory system is the complex series of veins and arteries and countless capillaries that the blood flows through. Circulatory systems are typically found in larger animals, where this vascular structure is the only reasonable way to sustain their size, because they can't move nutrients and oxygen through diffusion. Smaller animals can just rely simply on diffusion to move oxygen and stuff through their bodies, but larger animals just can't do this. Now, with regards to the circulatory system, there's two general types: open and closed. An open circulatory system is often found in insects, where the heart moves a fluid called hemolymph around the body. The circulatory system is open because the hemolymph isn't exclusively confined to blood vessels. The oxygen is simply mixed around like a ceiling fan mixes air in a room. Nutrients and oxygen don't necessarily have to diffuse across the walls of a blood vessel, as the hemolymph is often in direct contact with the insect's organs and muscles and other tissues. This is a low-pressure system that doesn't efficiently move around oxygen, and because of this, it's common in simpler, more sedentary animals with lower oxygen demands. Many insects, however, are highly active and very energetic, and so they compensate for their open circulatory system with a tracheal network, and that really supplements and boosts the amount of oxygen that they can bring in and diffuse throughout their tissues. A closed circulatory system, on the other hand, is entirely confined within blood vessels. The blood flows through the vasculature in a circuit, running back and forth from lungs to tissues. Thanks to their structure, a closed circulatory system has a higher pressure and a faster rate of flow than an open circulatory system. Furthermore, blood can be preferentially directed to tissues that have higher oxygen demands, or a lot of waste CO2 production. The blood is propelled via the pumping of the heart, which is a powerful muscular organ that rhythmically contracts to create these pulses of high pressure. In all animals, the heart serves the same function, but it may appear or function slightly differently. For example, the heart has a different number of internal chambers, depending on the species. All animals have at least one atria, or a chamber where blood flows in, and all animals also have one ventricle, or a chamber where the blood is pumped out. The number of atria and ventricles increased as animals diverged and diversified. The earliest animals, like fish, have two chambered hearts, with one ventricle and one atria. In amphibians and many reptiles, they have three chambered hearts that retain the one ventricle but possess two atria. And then you have mammals, birds, and crocodilian reptiles, which have four chambered hearts, with two ventricles and two atria. This increasing complexity developed as a response to the increased difficulty of pushing blood in a terrestrial body, where there's no water for buoyancy and the force of gravity is a lot more noticeable. The heart had to evolve to be stronger, so it could pump blood with more force, with more pressure, But the problem is that veins and arteries are relatively delicate. There's only so much pressure that they can handle. So in response to this, terrestrial animals evolved separate circuits for blood flow. The pulmonary circuit is relatively low pressure, and it carries blood between the heart and the lungs. The systemic circuit is relatively high pressure, and this carries blood between the heart and the rest of the tissues and organs in the body. In fish, the circulatory system is pretty simple. The heart pumps blood to the gills, where it picks up oxygen and then flows to the body. The body consumes this oxygen, and blood then flows back through the heart to the gills. In amphibians and mini reptiles with the three-chambered heart, their one ventricle will pump out oxygenated blood that comes from the lungs, it'll pump out deoxygenated blood that comes from the body, and it'll pump out mixed blood of both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Increasing cardiovascular sophistication across this evolutionary gradient has minimized this blood mixing, so as to optimize the available oxygen per heartbeat. In crocodilians, this mixing of the blood still exists, even though they have a four-chambered heart. But in birds and mammals, the mixing has largely been phased out entirely. The deoxygenated blood will flow from the body, through the venules and the veins, into the right atrium, and the right atrium will then pump this deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle, and this will then pump the blood into the pulmonary artery. It goes to the lungs, where the blood can then pick up oxygen, which it carries to the systemic circuit. The partial pressure gradient in the lungs will encourage carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood, through the alveoli and out of the body. And this is because the partial pressure gradient causes protons to detach from the hemoglobin and react with bicarbonate to form CO2 again, which then diffuses into the alveoli to be exhaled. As the CO2 is being removed, the pH of the blood increases, which then makes the hemoglobin more likely to pick up oxygen. So after CO2 is exhaled, the blood pH rises. An inhale will follow, and this will bring in oxygen that will then bind to the hemoglobin quite readily in this high pH environment. Once this blood has been oxygenated at the lungs, it will return to the heart by flowing through the pulmonary vein into the left atria. Then the blood moves from the left atria into the left ventricle, where it's pumped out into the aorta. And from the aorta, the blood then goes to get distributed throughout the animal's entire body. Once spread throughout the body, the tissues will tap this hemoglobin for oxygen, and in return, they'll release their waste CO2. So even though the heart is one organ, in these more complex animals, the heart is simultaneously pumping blood through two distinct circuits within the body's entire circulatory system. This combined effort is a perpetual flow of blood throughout the animal's entire body, and this enables not just the distribution of nutrients, but the distribution of life-giving oxygen, and the removal of carbon dioxide waste. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how animals engage in gas exchange. I hope you enjoyed this episode, because the chemical efficiency, the physiological speed, and the evolutionary importance of gas exchange and circulation are just so intensely fascinating. If you're enjoying this series, then stick around for next week's episode on the animal immune system. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.